start with a very quick presentation round. Okay? No?
You want to start? Yeah. Well, Thomas, thank you very much for inviting us in. I'm going to order you showing off. Really looking forward to this. As Alexa says, we are working together very closely. We work back at 3. And I'm looking at you, and I'm speaking as slow as I can. I'm famous for speaking very fast and having too many slides. But if there's anything, you just stop or ask or if there's anything. I have the slides, so I can always come back.
Siempre le pueden preguntar al que está al lado,
Please. But I'm Thomas, and I'm working with Giovanna, who has been with us for 2 years. Yeah, working specifically on the Connections project. She was hired in to help us, and maybe you have been in contact with Giovanna already. And I'm a professor in what's called urban open space management. So my field is the long-term perspective. When things are implemented, what do we then do? So this is also the focus of what I'm doing here. I'm a landscape architect by training. From Denmark, and now working with Sweden. So we'll come back to that. And I'm going to give this presentation today, and then tomorrow, those of you who will be here will have the pleasure to listen to Giovanna in Spanish. Right, just a little bit of background on where we're from. I mean, this is now my, I think, 3rd or 4th visit to South America via the Connections project, which is fantastic opportunity for us to come from Europe and to learn and to get experience. And the excursion yesterday was, so informative. And we were at the Regional this morning and seeing the slides with the Connections logo and hear them talk about it. It's just showing us how small the world is, as the small world is becoming. But still, this is a map of Europe. Just for those of you who don't know, this is a very long country in a European context, Sweden and Denmark. And I'm mentioning Denmark because we are actually located at the university right in the southern part of Sweden. There's also 2 other main campuses in Sweden. SLU is Swedish acronym. Somebody called it Sweden's longest university. But we are in the south, and if we zoom in the south, this is Copenhagen in Denmark. I actually live here, so I commute around and I cross a bridge between Denmark and Sweden. And then we have our campus just north of London. It's about 100 kilometers, just to give you a feeling about the distance. About there. And this is actually our campus. I thought I would show you this picture because it's very different from a big city. And this is where we are in the middle of the campus, and this is our building where we are working. It's called the Manor House or the Castle. And this is where Giovanna sits. This is where I sit. So very different from this big city kind of thing. Our department is for landscape architecture, planning and management. We have about 80 people. We are in 4 groups. We have very traditional planning, the large-scale planning. We have design. We have called urban vegetation, which is more technical, plant selection, establishment techniques, etc. And then we have the landscape governance and management, where I'm the professor. So we have 4 professors, one in each of these groups, and then that's how we organize about these 80. So we are, as you can see, about 15 in our group. So we have me sitting there. We have 2 associate professors, 4 researchers, 2 postdocs. And it's one of them 3 PhD students and 3 assistants. So very similar. Actually, we do a lot of teaching. So we have a number of educational programs. In landscape architecture, a 5-year program. Landscape engineering is a 4-year program. Horticultural design is a 4-year program. We have 2-year programs in Master in Landscape Architecture and what we call Sustainable Urban Development. And then we have a new international bachelor's program called Forest and Landscape, where we actually also have students from South America. We have Colombian and Brazilian students at the moment. In our little group, we have focused on what we call professional urban space, open space management, meaning we have a lot of focus on practice. So we do a lot of applied research. But we also, during the last 5 or 6 years, have been dealing a lot with theory building. And I'm going to show you some of the thinking that we're doing in that respect. We're now trying to not only look at management, but we also combine it with governance, realizing that we cannot really talk about long-term management without talking about governance. I'll come back to that. And I think we are actually, just being 50, we have a pretty strong international network, not at least because of connections, for example. I'm just showing you this one because this is a book we published 2 years ago called Urban Open Space Governance and Management, which was actually produced by the whole group. So we used that a couple of years within the group to discuss and then together write a book, and we got it published. And we're very proud of it, but we also think this is the first edition. So the second edition will be much better. But if you're interested, okay, let's jump into it. Being here since Sunday, I realized the differences between where we come from and South America. And we know that we talk about that in connections all the time. I talked to Alvaro yesterday about some of the key challenges here in terms of why people visit and use green spaces or why they don't use these green spaces. So I took this one, which is a paper from 23 from Swedish authors saying, why don't we go outside? That's the title of it. And these are the key reasons why people use or do not use green spaces in Sweden. And here you see that 60% say, well, nothing stops me. That's basically no reason why I shouldn't use a green space. And you talk about 10% of less talk about the insecurity, the feeling unsafe, which is a huge matter here. I just want to express that I'm aware of some of the challenges and some of the differences, but I also think that there's a lot of things that we can share in terms of how we are organized and how we are dealing with the overall planning and management and the long-term perspective. Some of the challenges that we see organizationally are very similar, no matter where we are. This is a figure showing the 3 typical layers in any organization, where you have a policy layer setting a direction, making a policy, making a vision. And this is in a let's say a government or the regional that we were visiting this morning. This is where the planners and managers are sitting, making the plans, creating the overviews, making the designs. And this is the operational level where you're actually doing things, planting the trees, mowing the lawns, simply doing the operations. You have operations, tactical, and policy. And there's a need to have a flow here. That's what they call the vertical alignment. That there's a link between the direction we want to go and what we do. But the challenge is that we are working in many different silos. So we have a technical department, maybe having responsibility for the parks, but you also have a social department which may have responsibilities for the green spaces outside the institutions, the urban homes. You have a cultural department which sometimes have responsibility for the sports fields. So we may have an ambition about combining human health and green spaces, but it's being dealt with in many different departments, and how to make sure that we're actually doing the right things in the right place require what we call a horizontal alignment. So there's a need for both aligning vertically and horizontally, and that is common in most countries, in most cities, in most organizations. So that we have, and that we are working with, that is essential to our understanding also of governance, the organization aspect. So this is something that we need to do, the new investments, ongoing resourcing of public space. That's going on at this level. The maintenance of operations, the regulation of use, the conflict between uses, this is governance, and the coordination of what we do is going both directions. Okay, make sense? So, this is very basic in the sense that we have these challenges: climate change, urbanization, pollution, biodiversity loss. They are also universal. We deal with it in slightly different ways, but we are dealing with these issues. This is from Copenhagen a couple of years ago. What we call this from this urbanization. So, and we know also, being in the room here and what we're working with, that we have a solution to many of these challenges, being green focused. We have the evidence. We're still publishing on the evidence, but we basically know how to deal with, or how to at least address some of these challenges via green spaces and trees. In a European, or you say Western world context, because this also includes North America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, not least, we experienced a trend in organizational development in the mid-80s, 1980s, driven by Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher in the UK. You know, I would say it's but right-wing, right? They had a strong belief that the public organization needed some kind of revitalization, needed to be looked at in a different way, needed to be more effective. And their political belief was that the way to do so would be to engage the private sector and be inspired by the private sector to do things differently within the public organization. That was very pronounced also in Scandinavia, the Nordic countries, and the Western Europe. And New Zealand was one of the leading countries, actually, but also in the US. And you may recognize some of this, but I'm not an expert in to which degree new public management was actually expressed in South America, so I'm a little bit reluctant. But that had a huge influence in how to plan and manage green spaces also, because new public management was about basically to deliver a better service, which is fair, you know. Revitalize the organization by the private, improve performances, secure efficiency, have better economic control, and not at least engage the private, but it was via businesses. Right. For green spaces or urban forestry, it meant that suddenly those who were going to take care of the green spaces on the operational level would be private companies. So on the tactical level, the planners and the managers started to think about, okay, how can we engage the private businesses? Okay, we need to write very detailed descriptions about what they should do, but also how we should control it. Now we're talking about indicators, like we do connectors. So a lot of focus for 20 years has been on describing how to mow the lawn and how can I control how to mow the lawn. I put it very kind of briefly here. Instead of actually thinking about, you know, on the political level, what should we do with the green spaces? So it had a huge influence. And a green space like this one, you know, you have one type of lawn which would be described in one way. You would have another type of lawn which would be described in another way, because you need to manage it in a different way. You would have trees which needed to be described in a third way about how to do things. So a lot of focus on technicalities as a result of new public management, because you needed to be very detailed in describing the contractor, what they were supposed to do and what it should cost. And that was a new thing. Now, some decades later, we're talking about new public governance. Not only within green space planning or management, but within the whole society. A new public governance is actually about, again very briefly, but acknowledging that these big challenges that we have, climate change, biodiversity loss, etc., they're what we also call wicked problems. That was actually a term invented in the 70s. But new public governance acknowledge that these challenges are complex, and we need to work across the silos to solve these problems. So it's not only about seeing how we can describe and actually do things on a technical level. This is more about now that we use each other's competencies and qualities. So this is also very much about the informal relations, and it's about trust, where new public management was very much about control, describing detail, and see, if you're not doing what I'm paying you to do, I have to give you a fine because these are public money and so on. Now we talk about, well, relax, it's more about trust. Let's talk about it, let's figure out how we do things best possible. We also acknowledge that in the public, there's limited resources. In our part of the world, and I'm pretty sure in Chile as well, the population gets older and older. But we don't necessarily get more money into the public system, meaning that the fight for resources increases. So it's not likely that there will be more money for management of green spaces, even though we know we have the solutions. We have to think in a more creative manner, in a more cooperative manner, maybe to include the private in a different manner, where they can contribute in a way we haven't seen it before, simply because we need the knowledge to solve the wicked problems, but we also need the resources. Right. So this is all about new public governance. It's a social orientation, and it's about generating common understanding of what the public value is. It's also acknowledging that we as designers and planners and managers, we may know because we're well educated. But those who really knows are those who live out there. So, management of green space, nature-based solutions is still very much influenced by new public management. We have learned a lot during the last 40 years in organizing, describing, focusing, being more effective. But we have this new layer on top of it. Now we are actually talking about the nature-based solutions, for example. The nature-based solution is about being inspired by nature, and you can interpret that in many ways. I will come back to that a little bit, but Giovanni will talk more about that tomorrow. Nature-based solutions is also about this multifunctionality, acknowledging that we're not just having a lawn because it's nice to look at. Now the lawn should also function as a water storage area, as such, as we saw yesterday, for example. So we need to put another layer on everything we're doing, thinking in multi-dimensional, multifunctional ways. And also something has happened to the public, because the public now wants and expects to be involved in a totally different way than what we experienced like 40 years ago. So that's a trend like this individualism, for example. At least that's something we experience a lot. People working in public organizations are using a lot of time on the telephone answering questions from the public, talking about this or that. They want to be involved. So now, it's not so much about how to do things, describing as we did in new public management, it's more about why we're doing things, involved and engaging. That's the new public governance kind of trend. So that's one of the evolutions there. So at the same time, there's also been some kind of evolution in the way that green spaces, or now we call it nature-based solutions, but how green space has been thought of in a large scale. And I'll do this very, very quickly, because you all know about this sustainability and how the Brundtland, actually the Norwegian Prime Minister in 86, 87, signed this sustainability, our common world, a way of thinking. Now we need to acknowledge, the environment is going the wrong direction. We need to acknowledge that it's not only about economy, it's also about ecological matters, but it's also about the social matters. So this was a way of thinking. In 2005, this notion of ecosystem services was introduced, and you're all familiar with that also. From a green space perspective, that was very nice to see that also the cultural ecosystem services, the empowerment, the senses, the smells, were suddenly put on the same plate as the production of wood or the CO2 sequestration. So in that sense, that was a very nice way of having a new type of focus on green spaces and the values of green spaces. But to get it rough, it was basically a systematization of the values of green spaces. It's not a tool, but it's a way of expressing the values. Now we're talking about nature-based solutions. This is about actions. And you can put it a little, provocative, saying, well, one way is to have a way of thinking being sustainable. Another way is to systematize the values of nature, but now it is time to act. And that's the basis behind the nature. Now it's an action. That has also been criticized a little bit because this is all about use of nature. And it's a very anthropogenic, a very human-centered perspective. Nature's value for humans, or how we can actually use nature as an action to solve all the problems that we have basically made and created ourselves. Now we want to take back and use nature to solve these problems. That's a paradox also. Maybe I should just, I know time is flying here, but that one. This is the call text from 2015 from the European Commission, where they started these projects where Connexus is now a part of it. They have funded, I don't know how many large-scale projects. Connexus is about 12 million euros, 10, 12 million euros? 6 million, sorry, 6. But there's been previous projects of the double size. And many of them doing more or less what we're doing. This call was then focusing on the cooperation between Europe and the CELAC countries. We have another project going on between Europe and China. Also is involved in that one. So EU is pumping a lot of money into this, and for a reason. Right, there's also been some critique of nature-based solutions. And these are some of Giovanna's slides. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, and we'll start into that tomorrow, but they are human-centered, anthropogenic, in a critique. Right, what about nature? Being inspired by it, what does it mean? Just for the good of us, what about the good of nature? There's been a lot of focus on technological imitations of nature, but we're doing things. I think about it a little bit yesterday, for good and for bad. I mean, some of the things we saw yesterday, that the water cleaning setup is fantastically mentioned. But this is, I think, a very, very good example of a technological solution of nature, using nature, but also having a technological approach. It can be very good. But there has been examples, for example, in some other countries, other parts of the world, where you have done things, moved water, and then it has been a nature-based solution, claimed, but that actually there has been no green stuff or no nature in it. So now in Europe, it has, the definition of nature-based solution has been expanded. So now it's not only about being inspired by or promoting nature, it's also about securing a biodiversity dimension to it. There has to be some green stuff in there to really claim it's a nature-based solution. Right, the focus on solutions and services can be an limitation also. And it can be constrained by practice. We have lack of documentation, so there's a lack of political will. What are the effects of all these interventions? Does it work? Can we actually document it works? How do we document that we engage a lot of people and makes a lot of good for them, or the cultural ecosystem services? We are fighting with that in Connexus. How can we measure and document the values and the quality of good? As long as we cannot do that, we will also experience that the politicians are reluctant to put a lot of funding into it. Because let's say for the water quality, it's easy to store the water away in a pipeline. Exactly, you can measure how much is going in there, how long it takes. But when you have an open solution like a sun, what happens then? So that is an experiment, that is an investment. Dominant forms in economic development, we're still spending a lot of time on establishing, but not really having funding for the long-term maintenance or management. So inadequate planning and management. Based on some of that, we came up with an idea about for nature-based thinking, which is also central in Connexus. This way of really being inspired by nature, taking that to the full extent, saying, for example, in the organization, we need to work across the silos. That is inspired by nature because water runs across administrative borders, right? Just like, so nature doesn't really care about how we organize ourselves as humans. So that's some of the basic ideas about nature. Joanna will talk about it. Right. Very quickly here, we have about 5 minutes or so. Management. I'll talk about how we look at management and governance in combination and how they are linked in order to kind of answer to some of this. And Actually, some of our colleagues from SLU made a definition of management, green-based management, or native-based solution management, saying these are the activities performed by a management organization in order to maintain, but also to develop existing green spaces for the users. So it's both about maintaining, mowing the lawn on the operational level, but it was also about developing tactical level. And we're doing it for somebody. We do it for a reason. Some of our colleagues from Sheffield University actually made a definition very similar in 14, saying this is about maintaining and enhancing quality to maximize benefits for users. So this is basically the same, maintaining and enhancing development for users. And we have kind of related to that one, basically. We have also in our little book I showed before been thinking about what does this mean, this long-term perspective of maintenance and developing. And we, in our department, we have a planning department, we have a design department, we have an urban vegetation or construction department, and we have a management department. You probably recognize that. There's a logic in that. But we now say, well, this is basically a 150 or 200-year process of maintaining. And while we are maintaining, we are constantly being addressed by new societal challenges. So we need to replan and redesign and reconstruct while we are maintaining. That's what we call management. So this long-term perspective of constantly being adaptive to new challenges and new corporations, that's what we call management. So those definitions actually have three dimensions in them. They have the organizations who owns or manage the spaces, the nature-based solutions, and they do it for somebody. So with a little bit of creativity, you can say this is actually defining management being sustainable, because this is the economic dimension, this is the ecological dimension, and this is the social dimension. Okay? So management is, by definition, sustainable, if you do it right. But management is about acknowledging that green spaces deliver services for somebody, for the users, the ecosystem services. And the organization should then do management, decisions, and maintenance in order to develop the right services for the users. But not only that, the organizations also need to work with the users. So it's not only about how to mow the lawn or to focus on what kind of CO2 sequestrations numbers can be fixed. It's about discussing with the users what are the right management decisions in order to deliver what is relevant for the users. And this is user engagement, this is also about governance. So now I actually talk about governance on two levels. I talk about governance on the inter-organizational level. The vertical and the horizontal alignment is the way of governance. But very often we refer to governance when we talk about user engagement. In a governance and management perspective, these three dimensions should be included in everything. And that was very inspiring also yesterday. And I have that in the back of my head. How is that working? To combine these things, you can see what is governance then, it can be understood as the inter-organizational or the relationship between the organization and the users. Some Dutch colleagues have described a governance arrangement, the setup of, what does governance actually include? They have described it as a tetrahedron, this triangle, four dimension, saying we have always some actors involved. There's always some resources related to this. How much funding is put aside for this? How much knowledge do we find out there among the users in the organization? There's always some rules we have to relate to. Laws, regulation, plans on the policy level. And not at least, we all have our ideas about what we want to do. And different types of actors usually have different types of discourses. And this is kind of interdependent, so the policy may be setting a direction, setting a discourse, but is that always aligned with the actions? Does it always align with the number of resources and the knowledge that we have accrued? And does it fit within the existing rules? Those four dimensions are describing a governance arrangement. And these governance arrangements can be more or less inclusive. You can go from the city, the municipality, having a vision, a policy, setting out a plan, and doing it. That's what they call the hierarchical governance. And you can go all the way to the self-governance, which in our part of the world would be usually in a community garden, allotment gardens, for example, where the land is owned by the city, but you kind of allow all the decisions to be made by those who actually live there. Then you kind of skip all the responsibility except from the ownership. Then it becomes self-governance. And then you have all these different types, and I think we probably introduced a lot of these different, more or less inclusive governance approaches. And in Europe, there's a clear tendency that you're going from this new public management to this more new public governance approach. And this is my last slide. Very confusing maybe, but also very simple. Because this is a landscape, these are different solutions, different ways, from the private car to the public park, and everything in between. These are the users and these are the organizations. And the organizations may have an idea, may have a plan, a political decision, a discourse, but it does not always align with the users. But the trick is to have a dialogue and setting a common direction, figuring out what we're doing and why we're doing it, figuring out what to do, where to do it, acknowledging the number of resources. So the public organization in the public park obviously have a lot of power and a lot of resources here, and the influence from the users may be very, very limited. But it may be that the further we go to the private sphere, the less power we will have from the organization, and the more power we will give to the users. And then we see that there will always be these rules and regulations behind it, and different ways of then setting up this whole governance arrangement, being either one of the extremes is unusual, but the most usual would be some kind of a self-governance, co-governance arrangement where we kind of steer away. But it's also acknowledging that very often it goes from the owner, the manager, the former owner, which would be the local government, actually setting the direction or acknowledging how much power are going to give away. Okay? I was inspired by the Such project yesterday. This is a project from Copenhagen. The whole city, they decided to make green. But not only make green, this is the outset was climate change and trying to make water storage. But then saying, well, maybe we can do more than that. Maybe we can add a dimension to it. So it's also a recreational area. If they are storing water here in these areas, or what was asphalt before is now a recreational area, biodiversity area. This before, on a grey Copenhagen afternoon, and also on a grey. You can discuss whether this is a nature-based solution or not. These are trees, some of them imported, but bought in from the nurseries, big sizes, but leftover trees. Trees should not fit into the normal structure of having these single stems. So they took all the leftovers and were able to actually buy a lot of plant material very cheap. But you can discuss whether it is nature-based to make an instant park. We heard about this required microforest, which is more nature-based, I would say, but they bring it up. But it takes time and so on. They have maintenance issues here also, but this is instant. This is basically overnight that you can establish it. You see you have the Copenhagen bench there. Now the cars are basically driving. Right, I have another, just one picture here from the Queen Elizabeth Park in London, where they are actually, I think, showing in a very, very nice way, both addressing climate change, biodiversity, human health, well-being, recreative, the sports fields, and so on. Highline in New York, you may know, this was the first part, very well designed, very detailed design, but the second part is basically just leaving things, not doing anything. This is nature-based, this is not, and this is nature, but not as nature-based as this one. This will basically take care of itself. If it's dry, if it's wet, this is how it is. And then from Rome and from Hyde Park, this very fine 18th century British landscape park, where they're now increasing biodiversity. You can discuss whether it is nice or not, but at least it is an attempt to add another dimension to this previous look at park. Now this look at park is also becoming a butterfly park. And in Rome they just don't do anything. It could be because of lack of resources, but I think we are now as students also kind of accepting this kind of image or aesthetic which is coming along with the native aesthetic. So that's a thank you. I think that goes on.
Como ese concepto de cambiando el tiempo y sigue cambiando, ¿no? Como sigue evolucionando. Esto de la sustentabilidad que hablamos permanentemente, algunos términos entiendo que se sigue ocupando, la importancia de los servicios ecosistémicos en su momento, y yo hoy en día ya la naturaleza, las soluciones de la naturaleza como base. Nosotros como profesionales ejecutivos modificando ese lenguaje y bueno, y este espacio de fundamental también para la conversación simple poder conceptualizar mucho mejor e ir definiendo en conjunto la importancia y la relevancia de la profesión. Eso me parece
Just a question. Well, thank you for your presentation. It was really fascinating how you show this evolution, this shift from the new public management to the new public governance. And my question is specifically regarding this shifting process. According to your experience, what do you think should be or has been, for instance, the key institutional arrangement in order to transit from the new public management to the new public governance? Is there any changes in the institutions, for instance, in the regulations?
I think that the change that we see now is actually coming bottom up, very much from, and it comes from a pressure in society also. But I think most organizations will now claim that they are not new public management organizations anymore. Green spaces was just a part of it. You also saw it in cleaning the public buildings, for example. That was all the cleaning was outsourced. You say that's a technical thing. Mowing a lawn is a technical thing. But people realize that, well, it's not about just mowing lawns. It's also about why we're doing it, maybe giving access also. And the same with actually cleaning the rooms. It came to a point also where the care of the elderly was outsourced, or the child care was outsourced. And suddenly, private businesses should make money on taking care of my mother. Is that right? And a lot of conflicts arose about controlling or following up, and you spend too much time on actually controlling instead of developing. And I think there was a general trend, not only within the Greens sector, but also within other sectors. So in that sense, there has been a general shift in perception of, okay, we need to be in control of what happens and what it costs, but we need to do it differently. And at the same time, we see that people want to be involved very differently. Right? I used to use that analogy that when I was a little child and I hurt myself, my mom would take me to the doctor. And the doctor would tell my mom what was wrong with me. He'd give me a prescription, and then she would go home and she would buy it and they would give it to me. Now when Joanna goes to the doctor with her son, she had been on the internet first. And she knew what's wrong with her son, and she wanted the doctor to tell her what she has read on the internet is wrong with her son. And if the doctor could not agree, you go to another doctor. And I think that's a general shift in society. But the shift in organizations has not really followed. We are still having the same silo-structured organization as we had 40 years ago. We're lagging behind. And we need new governmental structures. And I think the life labs, as we're trying out there, is a way forward. This experimentation and being a public organization, allowing room to experiment. I think that's the way forward.
Thank you.
And Thomas, what about NbS when we move from government to governance in this new model of governance, we are transferring power to private actors. And maybe it's different in Europe, but I would say here in Latin America it's a little bit risky, because we are transferring power to private actors to make important decisions in a city or a country, and we have many problems with corruption, for example. So I don't know how we can deal with that, because essentially we are transferring power to new actors, which have different interests. For example, having more profits or something like that.
I would still argue for having the 3 dimensions, right? But insist that all 3 dimensions should be involved in everything. Also those who owns or manage the land, the municipality or the regional or the public organization. And it may be that you will give less responsibility because you are aware about some of these challenges. But you still have to think, consider what kind of responsibility I can actually give while still being involved or being in control. It's not about giving everything out there. And I'm thinking about a concept we also are using in connections called mosaic governance. The mosaic. If you look at the city from above, you will look at all these different interventions, all the different pilots you have. They are all different. But there's not one solution that fits all. So in some places you can give a lot of responsibility, and in other places you give very, very little responsibility. And I think that is actually one of the key responsibilities working in a public organization. Because there you are a steward, you are kind of representing the taxpayers' money. You have to make sure that these are being dealt with in the most efficient and correct manner. And that could be that, okay, in this project, we cannot really give a lot of responsibility to the private sector because we don't really have seen enough trust. Trust needs to be built also. Some people say that trust needs to be built. So I would go about it, but I would never leave the 3 dimensions. How challenge ourselves? How can we have all 3 dimensions?
¿Preguntas? ¿Comentarios?
I have a comment. Following that frame, I can see here in Latin America, this line, what can you see or can you compare? That I think we still, or the public sector, now what we say in Chile also, is very comfortable with delegating or keeping this kind of public management. So we are, you can see that the public sector is always making new guidelines, and they talk about participatory, but what we can see is that with the community, the state is not really a facilitator, but always can act as a constraint for the community. We can see in Conchalí that the housing program fragmented the community. And still now, they have a lot of repercussion now, and the economic bar is trying to fill in this gap, making the community together, because the state only provides housing for the half of the population and all of that. So I see many difficulties here in how the public sector can transfer or can really, because I think that we need to think in a different manner, and governance can make this shift to a more creative way, because also in Latin America we have very lack of resources and all that, so we say, okay, so let's make more people together, more actors, and create a different solution. And yes, and also look into the housing programs and all of that, many solutions that you can see in other cities of the global south. We cannot apply here in Chile because we have many laws and we want to follow the law, so the state has very constrained.
The rules of the game and rule relations are there for this. So that's a part of the government structure to obey them. I think actually the example we saw yesterday, the first one, you show example of having two experts, right? Facilitating these processes. I think that's an example of a new structure, a new organizational structure, that you actually have dedicated people hiring to be in the local neighborhood, dealing with them, trying to think at different aspects of this local community. And that's the only job they have, basically. Making sure that people are being engaged, listening to what their needs are, and I'm super impressed about that level of knowledge and the commitment. I mean, they can talk at all levels. I mean, these are special people who can both talk to the politicians, to the planners, to the designers, and to the local people. These are bridge builders. And this is an example, I think, of a very promising way of addressing this issue.
Lo que presenta tiene muchas similitudes con nuestros propios aprendizajes de estos procesos de implementación de nuevos modelos. Nos hemos encontrado con problemas similares. En cuanto a las dificultades para una nueva gobernanza. Las soluciones basadas en la naturaleza requieren la articulación tanto de actores públicos, de privados, del usuario y de la integración. Y nos ocurre mucho lo que acabas de decir. En el fondo, la universidad, en los casos que hemos trabajado, ha sido el puente para conectar a personas con instituciones públicas. Cuando la universidad se va del lugar, aparecen problemas como los de ayer, el reclamo. Entonces, los vecinos dicen, es que esto está mal, porque nadie lo ordena, ya te lo entregué, no es mi responsabilidad. Entonces, es muy difícil tender ese puente y que perdure en el tiempo. Quiero mi barrio, creo que es un buen ejemplo aquí, porque intenta crear lazos más sentidos. Pero es difícil, porque duran un tiempo, tienen una duración, una permanencia temporal.
Right, super interesting. We tend to think about everything we do with nature as projects. We're limited in time, we're limited in resources. At the same time, we try to engage, and the example you give is that we may succeed in engaging people, but when the project is over, we leave. That is not fair, and it's not sustainable. It's not long-term sustainable, and it's not nature-based. because nature is long-sighted. I think we need to rethink how we're doing these things and think of being inspired by nature would for me mean that we are not doing project, but we're doing processes. Right? So when we start up a project like this, from the very beginning, we should start thinking about, how can we see this in 5 or 10 years' time? So one of the ambitions with that project may be the engagement, because that can secure, both overcome what you're talking about, but also secure that we have an engagement and a maintenance running on for 10 years. So maybe we should, again, organizationally move away from all these projects and look at it from as a process instead. And that's easier said than done. But we could maybe start thinking in a different way when we are setting up projects. And be, taking this knowledge in, because this is all over the place. We hear that again and again. Having said that also, I think universities play a crucial role in many projects, because I think we talked about that yesterday also, that we have an opportunity as university employees to actually follow up or maybe stay in a project for a longer period of time. In principle, we also dependent on funding. But I think the university engagement gives opportunities to stay there a little longer. But the projectification is a problem, and it's not nature-based. Nature-based is long-sighted.
Maybe this is related with this vertical alignment, because everything is now understood as a project. But what about this strategic level? What about the plans, for example? Our governor, Orrego, don't want to support. Is not totally convinced to support our green infrastructure plan, because it's a long-term plan. So he wants to have results in the next 1 or 2 years. So I don't know what you think about that.
You hit the nail, and we see that. I think we also talked about that. We see that in Sweden or Denmark also, that politicians are becoming more and more reluctant to sign the long-term plans. They're acting more ad hoc. And I think we all recognize that politicians like to get the ribbon and the photograph. That's the establishment, that's the creating new stuff, but they lack funding for the long term. And I think that's our challenge. As we are the green experts, we are the representatives for all the good things green can do and what green can contribute with for all these big challenges that we have. And that requires a longer term commitment. And it's not going in that direction right now, politically, which is strange, in a way. And then we say, what does it require for us to convince the politician? Are we supposed to convince the politician? Maybe not. But we should be better in documenting the effects. And that goes both socially. That's a very strong argument. To have a social impact on what we're doing. So what we're doing in Connection, discussing impacts and indicators is super important, because I think that's a part of the solution, to be able to much better in communicating. This is also about communicating.
Vamos con la última.
Well, yeah, thank you, Thomas, for the nice talk, and sorry for being late. I got some good ideas. I think I was thinking in this nature-based thinking that you were, I can't read the paper, unfortunately, but you mentioned this of the processes, that when you do nature-based thinking, I guess is related to thinking what processes can be actually fostered. So what, do you have any idea of which ones are the main ones?
engagement, for example, sounds for me like a crucial process. But what others could be the ones that can be kind of a priority in general sense?
And you refer back to what we mean by nature-based thinking, basically. I mean, the long-term, you're asking what long-term actually means.
Yes, I mean, I got the idea that you, when you are doing this nature-based solution, that it's not only projects, but doing a long-term thinking of what you want to foster in these communities.
Yeah.
But I am not sure if this is about nature-based thinking, because is it or not?
I think it is.
Okay,
I think
then if you think like this, which kind of processes we should consider? I think this is the main doubt that I have, because engagement sounds like a very crucial one.
yes.
To really be able that the community is engaged with what we are proposing.
Yes.
But what others would be important?
Just to take the engagement first, this is not native thinking in my way of thinking. It's not only about engaging, but making sure that via the engagement, it becomes long-term sustainable, so they can have as much, you could say, self-governance as possible, basically. So they are committed and can actually take care and maintain in the long term. And then you ask what else could it be? I think now we're talking about the microforests and micro-forests, right? And we discussed that with the radio this morning. There's a concept there, which is about you plant them very, very densely, and then in principle they should be able to take care of themselves. That, long term. Reduce maintenance, reduce cost, all good, but that requires a huge investment in the beginning in terms of maintenance and irrigation. If you don't irrigate for the first 2 or 3 years to make sure these plants are actually thriving, you lose your investment. So setting up these is both about the nature and how you can invest in them and make sure that they can be long-term. That requires technological insights and irrigation and the right plants in the right place and so on. It's about the users and what they mean, what they think, what they prefer, what is relevant for them. But not only that, it's also about a commitment to make sure that they are seeing the relevance also in the long term so they can be in there. And then from the organizational side, seeing that, okay, how can I set up myself so I can actually provide what is needed in the beginning as an investment, but also giving use as time is right. We are the experts. I mean, I think it's okay to acknowledge it.
But then this slide that you were showing the administration and the administrators and the users and the nature-based solution. So that means that the administration and the users should be more close.
Yes.
Closer or even be the same figure or theory. So that actually the users of the nature-based solution are also administration and administrative of that.
Eventually, maybe in certain places they will be administrators. Right? First of all, because they know what is of relevance for them on a local scale. And that's the official explanation. The unofficial is that they are also a resource. Right? In a time where we are lacking resources. So maybe they can do things which create an ownership, a relevance for them. So that would be the ideal, that the neighbors that we met yesterday are not complaining, but they are cleaning up because they have this ownership to it. So there's still a little bit to be done there in that sense, as a little example. Because then the city can kind of withdraw a little bit because the local ownership is there. And then the discussion would be, how do we do that? And it is a challenge. It's a huge challenge in our part of the world also. Finding time to do that. And that's why I think we should talk about processes again. Seeing this as a long term where you are integrating that in your daily work instead of having these additional projects. No, I can't handle anymore. Not another project. If it becomes part of your job to start thinking about this long term. Maybe that. I don't know if that was So it's not very clear, but yeah, but this is and this way thinking is still in a thinking phase. But I think it's interesting to think or be inspired by nature also when you think about organizations.
Usually the one that is very common in the cases that I have studied is the education, the process of environmental education in the developers. And we actually talk about this in some of the cases. So you don't have the environmental education, so the people want in Coachella. So people won't use this and will be keep using the place in a wrong manner, like destroying the. So this the value was absolutely involved in this education and process. Can be one education.
Sure. But you just said also that the users were using the place in the wrong manner. What does that mean?
I mean, it's the problem that they have now, that the square, for example, is used for dealing drugs.
That's a wrong manner.
Yeah. But not for the children going to the playground.
Sure. That's wrong. Actually, there are some. I'm very reluctant to draw parallels or compare my experience with practice with your real life. But we do have a small square centrally in Copenhagen, which was also public space, but occupied by wrong manners in all aspects. But over a long process and long engagement process, this place was redesigned and now reused, and it's actually functioning as a multifunctional space now. There are publications about it, but that was a very active and long-sighted engagement process with the locals. Because a lot of the locals did not really approve with the way it was used either. It was about security and safety and so on. But it takes a lot of resources. And I'm not saying that what happened in Copenhagen can be replicated. And also a lot of
So, thank you very much. We are going to have now the break, a 10-minute break, and then the second part we are not doing the dialogue as we planned, but anyway we would like to discuss a little bit further for 10 or 15 minutes. Okay, so now we have the coffee break, and again Thomas, thank you very much.